Hello and welcome to Sensory Revolutions, War, Peace, and the Pandemic Through the Five Senses. This is the first in a series of 4 webinars by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina. We're glad you joined us today, and we hope that you will find this topic insightful and gain understanding of how the study of history connects with many aspects of our lives, including our senses. Before we begin, we do want to invite you to check out our other webinar series, and you can view the full list and register at go.sc.edu/CASwebinars. And you should see that on your screen as well. Our speaker today is Dr. Mark Smith, a Carolina Distinguished Professor in the Department of History. He teaches American social and cultural history with emphasis on the American South and sensory history at both the graduate and undergraduate level. Dr. Smith has written multiple books, including The Smell of Battle, The Taste of Siege, A Sensory History of the Civil War, and Mastered by the Clock, Time, Slavery, and Freedom in the American South, which was a South Carolina Book of the Year. As an expert in sensory history, Dr. Smith will speak to us today about how historians probe the past with the five senses and how current events are shaping our sensory perception today. We are in webinar mode, which means you can submit questions using the Q&A button in your Zoom app. After his presentation, we will take time to address the questions sent in. And now, welcome Dr. Mark Smith.
Thank you, Jody, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me and for allowing me the opportunity to share some of my work on the senses. I'm often asked by students what kind of historian I am, and I reply that I'm an historian of the senses, and some of them look at me as though I must be mad to be studying something that happens every 10 years and involves counting. And I explain to them, no, not the census, the senses. I'm interested in not just sight, but smell and touch and taste, and how our sensory experiences shape the world and our existence. And it seems to me that the premise of this lecture, and indeed my entire corpus of work on the history of the senses, really takes a very simple observation and tries to run it back through time. That is to say, we are all creatures of the senses. We all inhale and we all taste, and we all listen. So why don't people in the past do that? And the answer is that they do. And that's what I'll be trying to explain today. So what I want to do for the next 30 to 40 minutes is explain to you what the history of the senses is, how it came about, and then give you 2 examples, I think, that speak to the complexity of sensory history, the complexity of how people experience the past, and how they experience the present. So I'm going to begin with a very basic observation. I could have the first slide there, Brian. And the basic observation is, what is the preeminent sense that guides our world? Or rather, what was the preeminent sense up until 2020 that guides our world? And that would be seeing. Because seeing is, or at least was in the modern period, considered to be the preeminent sense of truth. People didn't say smelling is believing, or listening is believing, or tasting is believing. Seeing is believing. And up until very recently, that was true. This is the modern sense. This is the most modern of the senses, insofar as the eye is the architect of authority, the avenue to perspective, the most reliable sense for gleaning truth. So what I want to do is explain to you how that came about, and then point out 2 examples in modern history where seeing didn't quite hold the authority that modern people thought that it did. Up until recently, seeing was believing. And even if you look at something as simple as legal evidence, we tend to believe eyewitnesses, but discount ear witnesses. We counterpoise truth versus hearsay, hearsay being somehow unreliable because it comes through the ear as being a less reliable arbiter of truth. But eyewitnesses always trump ear witnesses. And that to me is really the product of a modern moment, as is the establishment of the hierarchy of the senses. The hierarchy of the senses has a very distinct listing from top to bottom. And the idea is that sight is the preeminent sense, followed by sound, listening, and that's largely because sound is indexed to mathematics, so it gave it a certain scientific authority. And then the last three senses, taste, smell, and touch, are considered to be lower senses. They're considered to be the proximate senses because you need to be near something to taste or to smell or to touch. And these were associated, at least in the 19th century and thereafter, with animal senses. These are the lower rung proximate senses. So really for a few hundred years, this has been the hierarchy of the senses. Sight, sound, taste, smell, and touch was pretty much how the senses were arranged and how they were understood pretty much for the past several hundred years. Now, why is that the case? How did we assume this hierarchy of the senses? How did we get to the point where sight was preeminent, where sound was second, and the proximate senses brought up the bottom? And I want to take you through the principal developments that led to that hierarchy of the senses, that led to the elevation of sight. Really, the first thing that helped elevate sight was the advent of printing. And the reason for that is that the printed word, as opposed to the spoken word, trained the eye. It trained the eye to read. It trained the eye as the arbiter of truth. And the eye was the avenue for information. So with the advent of printing, beginning in the 1400s and then slowly taking off over the next several hundred years, you had the elevation, the gradual elevation of sight as the preeminent sense. And I want to stress something in this first part of the lecture, that these things take a very long time. The hierarchy that I just showed you is a product of hundreds of years of rearranging the senses into that hierarchy. The elevation of sight took many, many years to become preeminent. Go to the next slide, please. With the invention of printing, you saw a gradual shift from hearing to seeing. And you can see this in the way that people understood and conveyed information. Before the advent of printing, most information was conducted through sound and through the spoken word, which gave a preeminence to the ear, of course, because you have to listen in order to convey and absorb information. What the printing press did was gradually shift that emphasis on the heard word to the seen word. And what this slide here represents is a gradual shifting from an oral world, OR as well as AU, to a visual world. And if you wanted to chart this, you could look at the changes in reading habits over several centuries. When books were first printed, they were read aloud, largely because books were quite rare and that information had to be shared audibly. Over time, as books became cheaper, as they circulated more widely, and they became more available, people started to read silently, and they started to read internally, relying just on the eye as the courier of information. So here you have a good example of sight trumping sound, the gradual dissolution of voice and ear for conveying information and becoming hostage to the eye. This is a good illustration of that process, the transition to silent reading. Another terribly important moment in the creation of that hierarchy of the senses that I showed you, the elevation of sight and the denigration of the lower senses, was really the Enlightenment. And if we think about the word enlightenment, it is largely an ocular development. It is about spreading light, revealing things through reason. And many things during the Enlightenment, sort of beginning in the 1750s and for some historians ending in the first part of the 19th century, many of the developments of the Enlightenment catered to the eye. So we have the invention and dissemination of spectacles, which empower the eye to read. We have microscopes and telescopes. These are eye-empowering technologies. We have the advent of lighting at night. Lighting at night is to reveal the night and to be controlled through sight. Okay, so that the sounds of the night become less disconcerting because you've now revealed the source of those sounds. This is a quintessential expression of Enlightenment thinking. And then, of course, we have the advent of perspective painting and drawing, and this is a very good illustration. And of course, this takes hundreds of years to develop. But if you look at perspective painting and drawing, you'll see that it's very different than, say, during the medieval period where things were very flat. What perspective drawing does is it tags your eye, it brings you into the center of an image, and it trains your eye to seek out the focal point. And that is all to do with balance and symmetry and the kind of ordered quality of the world that was so important to Enlightenment thinkers, and the eye was critically important to that development. So this represents a significant change from the pre-Enlightenment past. Because the original iteration of the very common phrase that we've inherited, seeing is believing, was actually a longer phrase in the medieval period. The idea was that seeing is believing, but feeling's the truth. And what that suggested in the medieval period is that seeing was believing, but feeling could convey an authenticity too. So you didn't just look at a table, you didn't just look at a piece of clothing. Touching it gave you an authenticity that seeing alone could not do. Of course, also in the pre-Enlightenment period, faith came through hearing, according to Paul anyway, that one could hear God, didn't have to necessarily see him to have faith. Now, some of these ideas, the ideas that touch and taste and sound still have authenticity, some of those did continue after the Enlightenment. Some of them still have relevance in our own world. Passing the smell test would be a good example. People still use this phrase as a way to authenticate and validate a claim. So it's not that the Enlightenment dismissed altogether the other senses. Okay, those other senses still mattered just as they do to us. What it did, though, was establish the hierarchy of the senses with sight at the top. And it's that I'm going to talk about the most this afternoon, because I want to explain to you what sensory historians do. So sensory history is, people say it's a relatively new field of inquiry, and I suppose that's true to an extent. Certainly in the last 20 years, it has burgeoned, it's become very popular. But as with most historical writing, there's always a deeper genealogy, and we can trace the genealogy back really to the 1920s when historians started to think about what the past smelled like or what it sounded like. But for the most part, in the past 20 years, sensory history has come into its own. And I don't really think of sensory history as a field of inquiry like Civil War history or American history. It's really a habit of historical inquiry that any historian in any field can enter into. And the basic premise of sensory history is that our ancestors lived through the senses as much as we do, which is to say, why should we assume that they didn't have a sensory past themselves? And once you ask that question, once you recognize that people in the past did smell, did listen, did taste, then you can access their lived experience. So that's really the function of the historical inquiry here. And students often ask me, what particular sources do you need to investigate sensory history? And the simple answer is that you don't need any special sources. If you try to find in a card catalog or on a library computer search engine, smell or taste, it won't give you very much. And the reason for that is because the evidence is embedded in conventional sources. Those sources are the exact same sources that we use for every kind of research. The trick is to reattune your radar to things that are not just visual. So what I'm trying to do here with sensory history is to think, is not to reject seeing, but rather to add smelling and tasting and touching and listening to our historical narrative. And as I say, it's pretty much ubiquitous. I rarely read a source that doesn't speak to a non-visual sense. Even in the driest diplomatic correspondence, for example, you will find evidence of non-visual sensory evidence. So what have I done with this kind of habit of historical inquiry, and why might it matter? And I'm going to give you one example, and then we're going to conclude with what is, I think, a genuine sensory revolution. But the first example I'm going to give you is a sensory revolution of sorts. And this has been my work for the past few years, a sensory revolution framed around the sensory history of the Civil War. And I won't go into inordinate detail about the sensory history of the Civil War, but I want to explain to you why the Civil War, the American Civil War, was a sensory revolution, and why people were attuned to the senses during this Civil War. There are lots and lots of examples that I could point to, so I'm going to point to just a few, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have about other aspects of the Civil War. But really what I was trying to do in this book that I wrote on the sensory history of the Civil War was attune historians to the sensory experience of war. And I begin that book with a brief chapter on what Sumter sounded like. I mean, plainly, the bombardment of Fort Sumter was a visual experience. People saw the shells, they saw the explosions. But interestingly enough, people also heard them. And they heard them because these sounds were unique. These sounds were new. Very rarely had people heard the sounds of shells and cannon, at least certainly in that volume and that quantity. People had not really heard the sounds of shots to that scale before. And people commented on this in Charleston and talked about this brand new soundscape, how different it was from the soundscape of Charleston before, and how the firing of Fort Sumter punctured the night, altered the way that people listened and what they heard. And of course, from their perspective, this was a very, very loud and unprecedented moment. Try to think of the loudest sounds that somebody, the average person, would have heard before Fort Sumter. And that's probably the sound of thunder. Fort Sumter, the firing on Sumter and its sheer intensity made this a new sound, a louder sound. It turned up the volume on history. And that's really what people commented on, this kind of shocking moment. And in a way, the Civil War, when people say it started with a bang, they mean it quite literally, that sound mattered to the experience of the Civil War. So I dealt with Sumter and sound. I turned to the first engagement, the first large-scale military engagement of the Civil War, First Bull Run, 21st of July, 1861, to examine the question of sight. And this is an interesting example of where the soldiers marched into battle believing that seeing was believing. But many of them left that battle not so sure of the preeminence of sight. So by way of quick thumbnail background, this battle had enormous potential to stop this war really before it had started. And the idea here, of course, was for Union forces to capture First Bull Run, Manassas, then head on the 12 or so miles to Richmond, the Confederate capital, and sort of behead this rebellion as they saw it and stop things before they really got out of hand. Central to that moment of the Union attempt to win at First Bull Run was their attempt to capture Henry House Hill. And the idea was, if you could go up the hill and capture it, Union forces would essentially win this battle and potentially end the Civil War before it had really started. And so that's what they tried to do. So men in blue, the Union forces, trekked up that hill, ran up that hill. The idea was to capture it And of course, famously, all of a sudden, at the top of that hill appears Stonewall Jackson. And the Union forces stuttered. Some of them stopped. Not because they were fearful of Stonewall Jackson, but because his Virginia 33rd Regiment was wearing the color blue. They didn't know who they were. Were they Union forces? They were confused. The coloration, the color of the Confederate uniforms being blue was confusing. But precisely because they believed what they saw, they stuttered. Some of them were shot. In fact, lots of them were mown down. And that was the idea here. Stonewall Jackson knew that they would be confused by his Virginia troops wearing blue. And that was the moment when the first Bull Run, the Battle of First Bull Run, changed. And Union forces ran back down the hill because they couldn't maintain their momentum, because they were confused by what they saw. Jackson understood this quite well. He had his own soldiers wrap cotton wads around their around their arms to distinguish themselves from Union forces. But he knew full well that this was going to be a visual act of confusion. So what Stonewall Jackson was really doing was playing on the belief that seeing was believing. And he knew that it would create confusion in the Union ranks. And that, of course, was a Confederate victory in the first battle of the Civil War. So you have an interesting example there of the Enlightenment idea in the preeminence of sight actually causing significant military confusion in the first battle of the Civil War. For me, Gettysburg was obviously a very important battle, perhaps the most important battle of the Civil War. And plainly, it was a battle full of sights, sounds, and vicious touches, probably some tender caresses. But fundamentally, from the evidence that I looked at, Gettysburg was also about smell. And it was about smell for a simple reason. The technology of death outpaced the technology of burial. And of course, this bloodiest, really, battle of the Civil War, involving thousands of deaths, not just of men, but of horses and mules, occurs during the hot summer months. And there are so many people killed. There are so many people killed so quickly, they simply can't bury the dead quickly enough. And as a result, their bloated bodies are baked in the sun, and Gettysburg assumes the smell of death. And this is quite clear from reading diaries, reading newspaper accounts, reading any accounts of Gettysburg, that it really was an olfactory affair. And the interesting thing about the smell of Gettysburg, when you start to think of Gettysburg not just as a visual experience, but as an olfactory one, is that it changes both the time and space of the battle. Because the smell of death lingered for so long in Gettysburg that the feel of the battle was much longer than the few days that it took. The stench of death went on for months. One person said that they could even smell it when Lincoln gave his Gettysburg address. And of course, the actual field of battle, from an olfactory perspective, became a much larger area. You could smell this battle for miles. You could smell this death for miles. And this was something new to people. Even to people who lived in a pre-refrigerated age, nobody had smelled this level of death before. And in a way, this was a very powerful throwback for these moderns. In the 1860s, Americans saw themselves as modern, as having triumphed over the past. But now they're smelling the stench of death, and they're kind of thrown back to a medieval period where they think that's the smell of the past. It was an atavism. It was a shocking atavism because that nobody really smelt this level of death before, and very few people were going to smell it again. So Gettysburg was about stench and death. I deal with the question of taste through, of course, the siege of Vicksburg, which lasts from the 18th of May through the 4th of July, 1863. And of course, this is a very famous, successful siege by Grant, an effort to gain interior access to the south through Vicksburg. But really what a siege amounts to, at least in the evidence that I looked at from the people being besieged, was really an assault on the tongue and body. And the siege was successful. Successful from Grant's perspective, at least, because starvation led people who were accustomed to good food ordinarily, especially white southern plantation owners, who lived at the intersection of a railroad and a river that brought all sorts of fabulous food to them. Suddenly, but gradually, they experienced the denigration of their palate. So at the beginning of the siege, they ate normally. By the end of the siege, the palate of these refined people, their aesthetic taste, if you will, was reduced to a level of class that they weren't used to. So rats became expensive just to buy to eat. People gnawed on shoe leather by the end of this siege. Plantation owners and elites accustomed to extraordinary fine fare now began to eat dogs. This was a denigration in taste, and it wasn't just the act of eating, it had a social implication, an atavism. These people were being thrown back to a time they didn't want to belong to, thrown back to a level of status that they abhorred. And in that sense, there's a humiliation. And it's a humiliation through taste, and a humiliation through diet. This is almost a rearrangement of the senses insofar as people would eat food that was rancid. The sentinel of the nose, even your nose essentially tells you not to eat rotten food. But people in Vicksburg ate rotten food, ate rancid food, even though their nose told them not to. Such was the nature of their hunger. Ultimately, the end of this war, I think, changed the soundscape of the American South, or at least good parts of it, albeit temporarily. Because the end of this war was really in some senses, a silence of defeat. And here you have a visual where you can almost hear the silence of Charleston, its ruination. It stands stark and quiet. You don't get a sense of liveliness from this picture. You can hear its silence. And there's a reason you can hear that too, because even the church and all the churches in Charleston, essentially, they didn't sound like churches at the end of the war. Their bells had been taken and melted down for cannon in the Confederate effort to win this war. So even the things that were customary sounds in antebellum Charleston, the sound of bells, bringing people to service, in 1865, that sound didn't exist, and it didn't exist for some time. So in one sense, the end of the Civil War is about the silence of defeat. Next slide, please. And yet in another sense, the end of the Civil War changes the volume and cadence and register of the American South, at least for some time. And it does so because for now, for the first time ever, you had almost 4 million new voices participating in politics, giving their voice to democracy. These were the sounds of freedom from millions of people who had been silenced for most of their history. But in 1865, new voices come to the fore, and that is the other soundscape of the Confederacy and the end of the war. It changes how the South is sounded and how it's listened to. Okay, so that's my work on the Civil War, and there's lots more to say about that, of course, as with every historian. But I want to try to make sense of the past, bringing it into the present. And the reason I said at the beginning that the sensory hierarchy that I listed, with sight being first and very stable hierarchy, why that might have applied in 2019 is because I'm not so sure that it still applies with the same tenacity in, say, December 2019 as it does today in June 2020. And bear in mind, everything that I've described to you took a very long time to happen. centuries, really, in the reconfiguration in sensory ratios, the elevation of sight, the denigration of taste. But what the pandemic has done has changed and altered our conventional sensory ratios, has changed that hierarchy in a way that is remarkable for its speed. All those other things I described took decades, centuries. The Civil War, that took several years. This has taken several months, if not weeks. So what sensory impact has the pandemic had? And I'll invite you to think about this in your own lives. As an historian, I kind of take the aerial view, but let's just look at this picture here. I mean, this is a good illustration of where seeing is not believing. And you've probably experienced this in your own lives. People that you're intimately familiar with, your father, your mother, your wife, your husband, wearing a mask. You do a double take sometimes. Who is that exactly? And certainly when you've been to the grocery store, you can't always recognize people that you've known for years because of their masks. Seeing is a less reliable auditor, is a less reliable avenue for truth because masks rearrange kind of how you see. Let's go to the next one. What does this remind you of out of the pictures I just showed you from the Civil War? Isn't this the silence of defeat in Charleston? I look at this picture and I see empty streets in New York City, which is an odd sight to be sure. One doesn't see New York City like this very often. In fact, almost never. But we do now. This is not an unusual sight now. But I look at this and I hear it, and I hear silence. Or at least I hear a different soundscape. And you've probably experienced this yourself. When an entire economy and society is locked down, what you hear changes radically. Have you heard more birds over the past 3 months? You probably have. It's not because the birds didn't exist before, they've just been drowned out by cars, by chatter, by noise. Have you found yourself more sensitive to sounds that you once just took for granted, such as leaf blowers, things that are unusually loud and annoying? Yes, because you're home now. You hear them. These sounds existed before, but the reconfiguration of your soundscape has changed how you listen. If you were living near a school or a playground, your soundscape has changed too, because there are no children laughing or playing. Sounds like summer, really. In other words, the pandemic has altered how we listen and what sounds have been turned up in the context of a pandemic. Of course, there is the question of taste and touch too. I don't know if you've had a good meal during the pandemic, but I bet you that if you've relied on takeout a great deal, your sense of taste has changed too, because the food isn't as hot, your fries aren't as crisp. You're bringing things from a point that's far removed to your table, and that changes the taste of food, and it changes your eating habits. Perhaps you're eating different food now because you don't always want to get takeout, that while wonderful in the restaurant, is lacking once transported to your dining room table. Also, there are certain scarcities in grocery stores. You're not going to always be able to get what you want or how much you want. There are limits, and this is what the lockdown has done, what the pandemic has done. It's altered your access to taste. And then, of course, finally, and most obviously, the pandemic has rearranged our understanding and experience of touch. When did you last shake hands with someone? Do you find when you're introduced to someone that you stutter with your arm because you want to shake their hands, but you know you can't? You're 6 feet away from people ordinarily. There are no whispers at 6 feet. You have to shout. Just the tactile distance alters how you speak. There are all sorts of things that sensorially have been changed by the pandemic. I think that touch has become very domesticated. The only people you can touch are inside your home, your family. And there's a real benefit to that, the intimacy, the love, but not in public. Those tactile engagements in public have been suspended. The question is, for how long? Will this change us? Will it be like the Civil War that rearranges the senses for 4 years, and then we revert back to the sensory hierarchy that we had inherited? Or will this be more longer term? Will this have implications beyond our moment? If you want to know more about my admittedly evolving thoughts on the sensory history of the pandemic and what it might mean, I wrote a story on this, and it's on Yahoo News. You can find it there as well as other places. But I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to say thank you very much, and I'm happy to entertain your questions.
So we don't have any questions yet, but here we go. So how can wearing face masks impact our ability to read emotions?
Oh, I think that's a very astute question. So the question is, how can wearing face masks impact our ability to read emotions? I think profoundly. You've probably noticed this, and I certainly have, but if going into the grocery store, it's very difficult to ascertain if somebody's smiling. People who smile with their eyes perhaps is more obvious, but you can't read a smile under a face mask. And that's disconcerting, isn't it? Because ordinarily so much information is communicated emotionally through your facial expressions. But you don't have that anchor any longer. You don't have that coordinate now. And I don't find that to be particularly healthy, to be honest with you, because these things, reading facial expressions, grimaces, smiles, sadness, much more difficult when the face is largely covered. And we're going to have to relearn, if this continues, a kind of emotional register with our eyes. But that's the point, that our eyes don't really register the truth because you can't see it. So seeing is not really believing because of face masks. You can't see how people are reacting to you. And I think it's a great question because it's one of the real impacts of the pandemic. There's an emotional deficit here, or at least an emotional confusion courtesy of face masks.
And the next question is, how will social isolation during COVID-19 affect our kids and their senses?
How will social isolation during COVID-19 affect our kids and their senses? Well, I'm stepping outside of my bailiwick here. As an historian, I can give you something of an historical answer. That's really a kind of question for a psychologist or sociologist. I think is a terrific question. I can tell you only based on my own experience, and that is I have young children. And the thing that they miss the most is the interaction with their friends. I mean, mum and dad are fine for all intents and purposes, and sometimes quite funny and useful, but they can't play in the same way. The language is different. The kind of interactive platform is a much more different platform than it is dealing with other children. Whether or not that's a loss, my gut feeling tells me that it is. How long it goes on for depends very much on school districts' choices about how schools, if schools are going to be reopened. But I don't have a very good answer for you apart from a very personal one.
Our next question is, does the study of sensory history illuminate differences between North and South in the antebellum period?
Oh, that's a terrific question. I'm Mr. Randall Moore. Well, I did a book on this, it's called Listening to 19th Century America. And what I tried to do was look at the emergence of sectionalism, that is to say the tension between the antebellum South and the antebellum North, not by looking at the two regions, but by listening to what people heard. And by 1860, the soundscapes of the North and the South were becoming quite different. So the North, you could hear much more industrial activity. You heard freedom, you heard free wage labor. You heard it in politics. You heard a different kind of vocalization of politics in the North. In the South, you didn't. In the South, slaveholders and plantation owners valorized and embraced what they considered quietude. They enjoyed silence. They liked to be the kind of maestros of their world, in which they defined who could speak and when and why. So quietude and silence was considered to be a proxy for authority in the Old South. And they rejected the sound of the North as being indicative of the rise of the mob, the rise of free wage labor, which they found inherently dangerous and destabilizing, and the sound of excess democracy. So just by listening to the antebellum period, you can gain some access to emerging sectionalism and some of the emotion that was conveyed through those acts of listening.
So another question here in the room. It used to be we did not see people wearing masks in public very often. Now it's fairly common. And it occurred to me that, do we see a shift from here's a person in a mask, are they here to steal something or rob someone, to here's a person in a mask, that's very normal? Have there been similar shifts in looking at sensory history? Have there been similar shifts where something that was an unusual sight now becomes a common sight and it changes the way people see activity?
That's a very interesting question. And the answer is yes and no. Yes, there have been instances in the past, not having to do with masks necessarily, but where there's been a radical shift in the environment that changes how you see and how you hear. For example, outside of wars, natural disasters or environmental disasters often have that effect. So I've done some work on hurricanes, and I'm writing a book on natural disasters and the senses. And what natural disasters tend to do is rearrange the senses, pretty much like wars do, and pretty much like the pandemic has done. So you'll hear things you've never heard before: the sound of a hurricane, the sound of your house being ripped up. You'll see new sights. I mean, we're very used to a kind of linearity in the way that we see things, with sharp edges and very defined topographies. A hurricane erases that, and what you're left with is a jagged visual landscape. It doesn't have order attached to it. The smell after a hurricane, after a tornado, these things, food is rotting, bodies are rotting. It's almost like the smell of war. But they're temporary, right? The idea is to restore to normalcy. And that really is a restoration of sensory hierarchy, if you think about it. What this is probably something that's going to take a lot longer to restore. And the longer this goes on, the more difficult it will be to restore it, because people will become accustomed to things that they haven't been used to before. So your question, your example is a good one. Had somebody worn a mask 6 months ago into a grocery store, you would have thought one of two things: either the person is deeply unwell, or perhaps they're going to do something. But those things have been sort of suspended now. It is now everybody. And it is that kind of democratization of it that causes confusion, visual confusion, because you don't know how to read it.
Last question. What would you recommend people who are listening to you to do if they are interested in sensory history, and maybe they want to learn about the sensory history of their ancestors, of their cities and towns, or any particular point in history that they might be interested in? What would you recommend that they do?
I could give a very self-serving answer and tell them to buy my books, but I won't do that. I think that there are much more efficient and rewarding ways to understand your sensory past, and that is by talking to your elders and asking them what were the smells that you grew up with? What was the sound of your town? How did you shake hands? These basic questions, incredibly obvious questions, but questions that have never properly been asked. And by asking them, you'll enlighten yourself.
Mark, we do have one more question from one of our virtual audience members, and it's COVID-19 exposes health risks to food insecurity. How will sense of taste change in places like food deserts?
Well, that's a really interesting question and something I hadn't considered, but I want to consider. So in food deserts, I guess there had already been a sort of quiet and slow and painful revolution in taste anyway. So perhaps if there is an expansion in the scarcity of food and a kind of leveling in what food is available, perhaps there is a sense of food deserts becoming much more widespread, desert encroaching on places that normally can buy food as much as they want and as often as they want. But perhaps that is part of a new normal. That ultimately remains to be seen, of course. I should imagine if there is a robust vaccine that is discovered and disseminated in the next 6 months, perhaps there will be some return to normalcy, and perhaps those existing food deserts won't be food deserts for much longer. I don't know. But in a way, the more pressing and ominous question is, what if there is no vaccine? And perhaps the sensory revolution will be very long lasting. That's the case.
Okay, well, Mark, I want to thank you for this truly incredibly fascinating conversation with us. And to the audience, we want to thank you for joining. Again, we invite you to learn more about upcoming webinars in this series by visiting our website at go.sc.edu/CASwebinars, and that may be up on your screen. We also want to encourage you to join our social media platforms if you're not already part of the CAS family on our on our social media. We've got Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And again, Mark, thank you very much. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.